Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. In the United States, more talk of a new McCarthyism has been sparked by the Trump administration's threats against those it sees as its enemies at home and by its actions, including the designation of so-called Antifa as a terrorist organization and deploying the National Guard in a number of cities. Along with, we've seen ABC taking Jimmy Kimmel's show off the air, and Texas State University recently fired 2 faculty members, one of whom was socialist activist Tom Alter. Now, he's been reinstated by a judge. The case against him by the administration is still continuing. You can find links to related articles and support initiatives in the show notes for this episode. But all this raises the question of what McCarthyism was and what its lessons are for radicals in the US and elsewhere today. So to discuss this, I'm really glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by Alan Wald. So could you introduce yourself, Alan?
Well, yes, I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Michigan. My position was I held a special collegiate chair named for H. Chandler Davis, a well-known mathematician in the 1950s who was fired from Michigan for refusing to name names and actually sent to prison and ended up blacklisted in the U.S. and went to Canada, taught at the University of Toronto until his death. And my fields are mainly U.S. radical literature of the old left, 1930s, 40s, 50s, Marxism, communism, Trotskyism, and so on, literary intellectuals.
I should mention that your book, The New York Intellectuals, is the first one that I read by you, and I think it's a really excellent book that I would recommend to anybody interested in the history of the radical left in the U.S. in the period from the 30s through into the 50s. So before we talk about McCarthyism, could you just say a little bit to set the stage about the kind of repression that radicals experienced in the U.S. before McCarthyism?
Yeah, sure. Violence has been a part of the whole experience of the North American continent. We could go back to the European invasion and the genocide against the native peoples, slavery, and so on. With the beginning of the radical movement and the labor movement in the late 19th century, there's just a whole series of repressive and violent events. Particularly, let's say the late 19th centuries, there were prior to that, we can't forget the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798 and the Fugitive Slave Acts. These are all repressive and criminalization by the federal government of, in the case of the Alien Sedition, it was journalists and opposition politicians. And of course, in the Fugitive Slave Act, federal marshals were empowered to capture, not only escape slaves, but to criminalize any abolitionists who were helping the slaves. So there's that background. But with the rise of the labor movement, you had the Haymarket Affair, in which a bombing took place, and labor organizers were arrested, tried, and executed on very minimal evidence. You also had things like the Pullman strike. Then you had the famous first Red Scare, 1919, with the Palmer raids and so on, the persecution of the Wobblies. You had the Sedition Act of 1918 and the Espinoz Act prosecutions. And many people know that Eugene V. Debs was arrested and imprisoned under that. You had things going into the 1930s, the bonus army events of 1932, where World War I veterans were marching in Washington to demand an increase in their, or actually the payment of their bonuses, and they were violently attacked by federal troops. Throughout the 30s, labor movements were violently attacked. Many people know about the Gastonia strike. I'm right now working on the much forgotten but very similar situation in Gallup, New Mexico, a strike of miners led by Native American Indians and Mexicans and Mexican Americans. It was a terrible situation where people were killed, hundreds were arrested, terrorism in the town and so on. So that's all kind of the background to all this. During World War II, there was also repression. As you probably know, Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Probably 120,000 were put into special camps. There was the Smith Act prosecution. The Smith Act prosecutions. Smith Act was 1940, and in 1941 through 45, Trotskyists were persecuted for their anti-war policies. Then we have, of course, the second Red Scare. That's the big deal. First Red Scare, again, 1919. There's also a little Red Scare, 1939, where there were prosecutions in New York of radical teachers and so on. But the second Red Scare is most similar to the present day. And that basically lasts from, let's say, 1947 to 57, I would say. It's called McCarthyism, but that's not accurate because it really sort of began with Trumanism, with Truman's loyalty oaths and so on. And that was several years earlier. McCarthy seized on all this fear about communism and used it demagogically. But the loyalty oaths began much earlier. So there's that whole history of repression in the United States. But what interests me most are the rather extraordinary parallels between the second Red Scare and the current attacks on especially the educational institutions, but all of American society. Is quite astonishing.
We'll certainly have a chance to dig into that, but I'd like you to, if you could, just to maybe say a little bit more about what happened after the end of the Second World War. You mentioned, we should say this for the benefit of people who may not know U.S. history so well. So Truman was president after the death of Roosevelt, and you have the onset of the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, and as you say, then the initiation of new forms of repression, all done under the banner of anti-communism. Can you talk a little bit more about what was happening in that period, as you say, often called McCarthyism, but can't be limited to the actions of that one senator from Wisconsin?
Yeah. So immediately after World War II, in which the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in the Grand Alliance, things began to fall apart, and the Cold War began. The Soviet Union had expanded into Czechoslovakia with a violent coup, and the United States had aims on expanding its powers to replace the old empires of Europe. So things got very tense, and sort of, as you know, the Iron Curtain speech was given. Churchill fomented hostility toward the Soviet Union. Truman whipped up fears and so on. A loyalty oath was instituted. And at the same time, there was a post-war upsurge in the United States. I think that's important. It's one of the reasons why these Red Scares, they focus on a target like communism, or today it's the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. But there are larger things that the right wing is trying to go after. They're using the communism and the Palestinian protests as pretexts. After World War II, there was this labor upsurge. Some of the biggest strikes in the United States history occurred after World War II. There was an upsurge in the civil rights movement with new civil rights organizations. Black soldiers in particular had fought hard in World War II in a segregated army and came back expecting equal rights. And in fact, things were not much better. And then there was a situation of women. So women during the war had taken industrial jobs and they had gained a certain degree of independence. But after the war, there was an attempt to send them back into the homes and entered in sort of the trad wife role. So you had this kind of political upsurge happening at the same time as the United States was trying to discipline the population to accept its Cold War repressive politics. The right was trying to roll back the New Deal gains. So you had this kind of clash of left and right. And the anti-communism issue became kind of the fulcrum, the fear that communists were infiltrating the universities, infiltrating Hollywood, taking over the labor unions, running the civil rights movement. Communism everywhere. That was the excuse. Even though the communist movement was not, the numbers were, 20, 30,000 at that point, and they had a lot of internal problems and so on. They were not a major force in American life, but they were targeted. At the universities, there were, maybe 100 or so former members of the Communist Party, very few actual members. As Ellen Schrecker's book, No Ivory Tower, documented, most of the people targeted, they did have a left-wing past. That's true. I mean, a few might have been by accident, but most of them did have a left-wing past. But most of them had also left the Communist Party and were not active. Here at Michigan, among the people who were targeted, only one or two, particularly Chandler Davis, was probably the only one really active. The others had retreated into their academic work, although they were still loyal to the ideals of the past. Some had fought in the Spanish Civil War and so on. They weren't going to name, or most of them weren't going to name other people and so on, but they were not really active communists. So in any event, they had that pretext of communism to use in order to try to roll back all of these social gains.
I think the point you make about everything that's happening, having both an international and a domestic context is really important. And I'll just mention for people who may not have heard about this, certainly one book that's, I think, very memorable about the upsurge of the 40s of George Lipsitz's Rainbow at Midnight, which I think is very evocative about the class struggles in the 1940s and their cultural manifestations. So, just as you say, there was this domestic context and the international context of the geopolitical rivalry. But in the US, the main target of the repression ultimately was the Communist Party of the United States. Could you talk a little bit about the CP at that time, what kind of organization it was, and how its leadership responded to the repression?
Yeah. Well, the American Communist Party had always been under attack since the time it was formed, which was basically 2 years after the Russian Revolution. A left wing of the Socialist Party had split into several underground groups and eventually started becoming above ground. It was actually the Comintern, the Communist International, that occurred encouraged the U.S. communists to become above ground and run in elections and so on, rather than trying to imitate the Bolshevik experience before the Russian Revolution. So they'd always been under attack. There you can read about. There's a new book out. What is it called here? Called Menace of Our Time by Aaron Leonard. It just came out from Rutgers University Press. It's called The Long War Against American Communism, and it's a history of all the attacks on the Communist Party going back to the first Red Scare. Maybe it even goes back, to the first Red Scare. It has some earlier stuff about attacks on the left. So this is a pretty good documentary history of all the repressive things faced by the Communist Party. So you'll know that during World War II, of course, the Communist Party was in its super popular front phase. They called it the National Front, I guess, but it was basically a popular front supporting the Roosevelt regime almost uncritically, to the point where they backed the internment of Japanese Americans and expelled their own Japanese American Party members. They opposed the Double V campaign of the Black community for victory against fascism abroad and against racism at home. They opposed efforts to desegregate the army. I mean, they didn't like the fact they're segregated, but they weren't going to engage in any protest activities and so on. So they had a very liberal orientation during the war, super liberal, to the point where when there were rebellions in the urban centers, particularly New York, Detroit, Los Angeles during the war, the Communist Party said, these aren't actual rebellions of people of color. They're Hitler-inspired, occurring on orders from Berlin and so on. Really right-wing stuff. Most radicals today would see the Communist Party policies in the 1940s as basically racist. And by the way, their policies toward Israel, or the formation of Israel, were also very right-wing. Although they had good politics on Zionism in the mid-30s and even in the early 40s, they did, following the Soviet Union, they did support the partition. They opposed the return after the Nakba. They hardly mentioned the Nakba, although the New York Times did. They opposed the right of return, and they were very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel in the late 40s into the 50s. So here they had been this kind of liberal organization, but with the beginning of the Cold War, they switched back to almost what we generally call the third period politics. They didn't go quite as far as the third period, calling for revolutionary unions and so on, but they did set up an underground apparatus. They believed fascism was coming to the United States, and this is something we should think about, because the Communist Party, they said fascism, it was 5 minutes to midnight or something was going to come, so they sent their secondary leaders underground underground, set up an underground apparatus, and they changed a lot of their policies and so on. And of course, it wasn't fascism. It was very repressive. But, by 1956, or the civil rights movement had emerged, the Montgomery bus boycott. And then in the early 60s, we had the Berkeley free speech movement, the student rebellion. They really misestimated. So it was a kind of ultra-left sectarian organization in the early 50s. And they did fight back against the repression. I mean, it's interesting to look at the different policies they used. They hired any high-profile lawyer, including non-communist liberals, right-wingers, who would defend them, which was very good. They took a very clear position that their statements about socialist revolution were not the same as advocating immediate violent action or anything like that. And they used the free speech issue as much as possible. But, defending the Soviet Union in the 1950s was a tough sell. And anti-communism, there was some basis for people not looking very kindly on the Soviet Union when they heard about things that were happening there. I mean, many people already knew about the purge trials, the execution of 700,000 people in the 1930s, the things that they had done during World War II, even in the early 50s, there was the Doctor's Plot, there was the East German uprising crush. So defending the Soviet Union was not an easy position to have. But they fought hard, and they had a lot of defeats. But the Communist Party did survive as a small group into the 1960s, and actually, as you probably know, they had some growth and significance in the 70s, and they still exist today, although much debilitated.
Just to pick up on something you were alluding to, can you say anything more about what you think the party's self-inflicted weaknesses were when it came to coping with the repression?
Yeah. Well, of course, the greatest weakness was the fact that they were tied to the Soviet Union rather than independent, They took this position of when they were accused of being communist. I mean, when their members were accused of party affiliations, they at first they defied. The Hollywood 10 said, no, we have the right to say and think whatever we want, and under the First Amendment, we are just going to refuse to cooperate. And of course, they were then sent to prison with that strategy. So then they switched mainly to the Fifth Amendment. Now, not every communist followed the Fifth Amendment line, which is where you say, I simply will not going to say anything because it might be self-incriminating, which is a tricky position to take because you kind of look guilty. Why don't you talk? Why don't you say what your real affiliations are? But the problem was once you started to talk and say anything, you had to continue. You just couldn't selectively say, well, I'll talk about this, I'll talk about that. If you didn't cooperate with answering more questions, then you would be accused of contempt, and you could face a prison sentence. Also, you have to remember in these hearings, these were not legal hearings like a courtroom where you could see the evidence against you. They would ask you questions. Well, were you at this meeting? Did you do this? Did you know that person? And they would have secret evidence. So if you did fudge it and say, I wasn't there, I didn't sign that, they could produce the evidence at that point and say, you're lying, this is perjury. Again, you face a prison sentence. And even if you didn't get a prison sentence, the relationship between these hearings and business and universities was such that if you didn't cooperate, the universities would fire you. Your business would fire you. You'd lose your job. And it wasn't only the government that fired people under the loyalty oath. Those had to be employees of the government. No matter what job you had anywhere, your boss could just fire you because you had not cooperated and you were bringing shame and disgrace or controversy on the university or the business or whatever. So the communists were in a tough bind, and they struggled with different strategies. But in the end, this problem of taking the Fifth, and you were kind of, what are the alternatives? If you take the Fifth, you look kind of suspicious and guilty. If you don't take the Fifth, then you're going to, go to prison. Not everybody, a tiny minority kind of escaped that, but a lot of people did get either go to prison or lose their jobs through this taking the Fifth. So anyway, they filed a lot of appeals for these cases. They did set up committees to defend themselves. They did try to portray this as simply political oppression. But again, a lot of the American public was frightened about communism. And if you didn't clearly disassociate yourself, you were under suspicion. They did organize worldwide solidarity campaigns. And clearly the execution of the Rosenbergs is a good example of that. It was an international campaign to prevent the execution of the Rosenbergs.
Could you just, for people who don't know that history, say something about the Rosenbergs?
Well, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were communists in the 1940s, and they dropped their party membership, and they had a relative named Greenglass who was employed in relation to atom bomb research and passed some information that Julius facilitated. And they were implicated by other people who were involved in this kind of network. And generally, the Communist Party at first did not want to support them. They didn't want to get involved. But when other people, particularly around the National Guardian, began a campaign around the idea that the Rosenbergs were not communists and they had not done anything wrong and so on, then the Communist Party saw there was a potential there and they jumped in. They've been criticized for that kind of opportunism. So an international campaign developed that the Rosenbergs had not been implicated in espionage. The accusations were a fraud. The trial was a fraud and so on. They were convicted and sentenced to the electric chair. And subsequent revelations of FBI files and other material and the confessions of particularly of Ethel Rosenberg's brother and so on indicate that Julius was fully aware that he was passing on this information related to the atomic bomb to Russian agents, whereas it seems like Ethel was not particularly involved. She was just named as a way of putting pressure on Julius to cooperate and name other people. So they went to their deaths believing that they were fighting fascism and stopping the fascist takeover of the United States, and that they had helped the major ally in the world against fascism, the Soviet Union. We know that this belief in the Soviet Union was largely a delusion, but they went as anti-fascist and heroically. I mean, they were not doing this for money. They were not doing this for selfish reasons. They acted heroically and with bravery, but the cause to which they were devoted is not one that most of us would feel comfortable with, to say the least.
Yeah, so you've described a number of different responses to the repression, ranging from that forthright defense of the right to espouse Communist Party politics, all the way through to pleading the Fifth Amendment. Other things that people should know about the other kinds of responses that there were to the repression, both by communists and people around them, and also by others on the left?
Well, if you weren't connected with the Communist Party, you were in a much better situation. So other groups were on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations and did suffer some persecutions. The Shachtman group, the Workers' Party, had been on the list, and they got themselves off the list by having people testimony. And there's a lot of interesting history about who was willing to help them in that situation and who wasn't. To me, it's somewhat surprising the role that people played. The Socialist Workers' Party had a famous case. The Socialist Workers' Party was an orthodox Trotskyist organization of a man named James Kutcher, who was a working class guy, a Jewish guy from Newark, New Jersey. He'd fought in World War II. He had his legs blown off in Italy during the war. He came back and he got a job in the Veterans Administration in New Jersey. And suddenly in the 50s, it was discovered that he was an open member of the Socialist Workers' Party, advocating revolutionary socialism. He was fired. And they set up a defense case on the basis that, yeah, he's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party who has these views. He has a right to have these views and so on. Even though the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party had been convicted under the Smith Act in the 1940s and gone to prison. But in the case of Kutcher, they did win. Took 10 years, but they did win his back pay and his job. But again, they didn't have the burden of being connected with the Communist Party. It's true that a lot of Trotskyists and other kinds of radicals were persecuted during the 50s because, in a way, it was an anti-radical witch hunt, and the communists were just the excuse. But you were in an easier position, I think, in this situation if you didn't have that Soviet connection. There were other people minor cases, I think, of people who fought back on the grounds that they weren't communists and so on. But the assault was mainly focused on people who did have a communist connection. And even if they weren't members anymore, they didn't want to get into this naming things, because you would be asked to name your cousins, your brothers, your sisters, your best friends, people who you admired, and so on. And so a lot suffered just out of that idealism. And I think people stayed in the party. At least I work a lot with writers and intellectuals. I think there were people who were pretty dispirited about the CP in the early 50s, but stayed into the late 50s just because they didn't want to abandon this movement. And even afterwards, they didn't attack or criticize the party in the Soviet Union, partly just out of this sense of loyalty that people they knew and admired had been threatened and punished and so on.
What about liberalism? How did liberal forces respond to this anti-communism, this attack on the radical left in the years after the Second World War?
Yeah, so the liberals split into two groups. There were the so-called progressive liberals, like Kerry McWilliams, the editor of The Nation, that would be typical of that, who were not particularly hard on the Soviet Union. They were not communists themselves, but they were close to being fellow travelers, and they rallied around the CP and they basically played a good role. I mean, this is a period in which Stalinists and fellow travelers are rather the heroes. Then you had the liberal anti-communist who were anti-Stalinist, although actually, I think they were just an anti-radical, anti-communist. They call themselves anti-Stalinist because that sounded more sophisticated. You weren't one of these crude rednecks who was against communism because of race mixing or because he thought that it meant free sex or something. Like, you were more sophisticated about what communism. So you call yourself an anti-Stalinist, but they were beyond that in terms of their anti-radicalism. So they set up the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which some people who had been close to Trotskyism were involved in the earlier iterations of that. But it went beyond that. It wasn't just Trotskyist. So they played a pretty bad role in the sense that they said, "Oh yeah, McCarthy, he's crude, he's terrible, but we can't have communists functioning in society in these positions." They did not defend. Some of them may have defended Kutcher, who was a Trotskyist, but they did not defend the people under attack. And you can see that in some cases they took positions like, "Well, we don't want the federal government coming into universities and firing the communists, so we'll do it ourselves." We'll have our own. We'll get rid of the communists, and we just don't want the government doing it. So they took middle positions. So the liberals played a pretty bad role, which is sort of par for the course, in my opinion. They're playing a pretty bad role today too. The so-called Committee for Cultural Freedom at the very end of the 50s, when McCarthyism was discredited, they sort of began criticizing him more. Now, they always criticized his crude methods and so on, but they were kind of on board with the general witch hunt.
So when did that round of repression end, and what really brought it to an end, that phase of repression?
So it's generally dated, let's say 1957 is when it begins to die out, although things happened afterwards. I mean, the House Un-American Activities Committee existed into the early 60s. You probably know that some of the early events around the Berkeley free speech movement were protesting HUAC hearings. So this would be, 63, 64. So it didn't completely die out, but I think after McCarthy himself was disgraced, he was an alcoholic, and particularly the Army McCarthy hearings, where he was so bonkers, he was accusing the people in the U.S. military of being communists, and then all kinds of strange things were revealed about his relationship to he and Roy Cohn's relationship to other people who they were promoting and so on, particularly a guy named David Schein. It began to crumble around that point. So one factor was McCarthy himself. Another was a change in the world situation. That is, the colonial revolution had begun after World War II, and now by the mid-50s, it was starting to pick up steam. The Algerian Revolution and, eventually the Cuban Revolution and so on. And the political climate began to change internationally, and then nationally, the silent generation of the students became the Berkeley radicals. The civil rights movement, came back to life pretty early with the Montgomery bus boycott and the sit-ins. So this is late 50s. This is only a couple of years after some of the people on the left claim we had had fascism. Those are various factors that did change it. I don't think that the left, that it was the fight of the left that changed things. I don't think the left won. I think the left was defeated. Years later, many of the people attacked during McCarthyism were celebrated and brought back into the community and made into heroes. Hollywood 10 became very well known after that, and a lot of the professors who'd been purged were then honored. Here at Michigan, they never reinstated the people that were fired and purged and driven out, but within the context of the university, an academic freedom series was set up. I was given this chair in the name of one of the people they fired. Things within the framework of the university, even though the university itself didn't actually reinstate them or do anything major. There were some apologies from administrators, and I think in the New York area, a lot of the people who were fired were eventually kind of reinstated in some honorary position. A few might have been hired back in their old age.
Before we move to the present, what do you think people today most need to know about repression against the left in the U.S. in the decades from, say, the early 60s through to more recent years? Anything that really stands out as particularly important for us to know about that phase of history?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was repression against the left. We can look at, first of all, the early civil rights movement was viciously repressed. Those freedom riders, I mean, the police not only stood by when the freedom riders were beaten up, some of the police joined in. I mean, that's the kind of atmosphere. The race issue is particularly important, and people might be reminded of this with the news that Assata Shakur just died in Cuba and so on. Have to go back and understand the circumstances that led her to participate in the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army and so on. The racism was so intense. You felt in the 60s like this was a war going on against the African American community. But the Freedom Riders were beaten up. Remember Selma, which is celebrated Bloody Sunday. That was a case where the police, the Alabama police, with clubs and tear gas, attacked these peaceful marchers just going across a bridge. There was the assassination of Fred Hampton and other Black leaders. Fred Hampton, as far as I know, simply advocated self-defense. The only criminal thing I've ever seen was he had some kind of altercation with an ice cream truck driver or something. But I mean, he was assassinated by a coordinated operation of both the FBI and the Chicago police. The Attica prison uprising, that was also a case where state police came in and killed something like 30 inmates, and they killed a lot of the people that the inmates had taken hostage. The American Indian movement was also under attack. If you know about the Wounded Knee, where federal marshals and the FBI had attacked the American Indian movement activists, and Leonard Pelletier was imprisoned. There was just on and on stuff like that. And of course, after 9/11, with the blowing up of the Twin Towers, the Patriot Act was instituted with all kinds of new surveillance and profiling and so on, especially of Arab and South Asian people. So a lot of things happened after the 1960s, and even very recently, I would say the whole Black Lives Matter movement. They were attacked by the police and arrested. And Occupy Wall Street had incidents. So it's an ongoing problem, police violence.
And not just at the local level, but of course coordinated sometimes at the federal level. I mean, COINTELPRO suggests that this was not something that was somehow simply just done on a local level, but there was orchestration by federal authorities against the left.
Yes, the infiltration and attempt to foment conflict and violence within the radical movement and the framing up of people and so on. That's very important for understanding some of the extreme measures that were taken by a tiny fraction of the radical movement. Itself resorted to going underground and committing attacks that destroyed property, and in some cases, targeted police and so on. It was it was acts of desperation in response to real repression. And we can't underestimate this violence against the Black community. I mean, now we have videotapes where people who are pulled over by the police can videotape some of the things that are said to them and the threats that are made and so on. But back in the 60s and 70s, these just happened, and there was no way to document it, no way to prove it. In Assata Shakur's memoir called Assata, she describes the kind of things that were said and done to her when she was profiled and taken in by the police, and they're pretty awful. So, if you yourself are not in the crosshairs of this, if because of the color of your skin or not, you can't understand it. It's like seeing Zionism from the viewpoint of its victims rather from the viewpoint of the people who benefit from it. To see the U.S. police and state troopers and so on from the viewpoint of ordinary Black people is quite a different thing. And we have to be careful in making judgments about people's behavior, not knowing the full context.
Before we talk about the present moment and Trump and so on, can you talk a little bit about in the immediate period after October, 2023, and the role, well, this is still under the Biden administration, of liberal support for repression against Palestine solidarity activism?
Yeah, that's really the current phase, which led to state intervention in the universities and so on. The events of October 2023 are absolutely, it's a critical turning point. I mean, there have been pro-Palestinian activism on the campus before, and it had been slandered as anti-Semitic, and it was hard to get speakers. I was involved in trying to get Noam Chomsky to speak here, and we had a terrible time, and so on. But after the 2023, everything changed. At first, of course, we know that when the attack took place, people were the breakout from Gaza, and which led to the killing of thousands of people, including many civilians, and human rights violations and so on. Tiny few people saw only the act of breaking out, the gliders and people rebelling and so on. They didn't really fully understand the violence that took place after that. And they said some uncool things admiring that, which they later took back. And then once the protests started, there was a lot of confusion about what the slogans meant and so on. And so immediately this apparatus went into place saying, oh yeah, this is anti-Semitism. These are not people protesting what the Israeli state is doing and has done. These are people who hate Jews. If you call for a democratic state of all the people, well, you must be calling for the Jews to be thrown into the sea. If you're calling for use the slogan from the river to the sea, you probably don't know which river, you don't know which sea, you're just calling it Jew hatred. And other slogans that were not clear and not explicit were interpreted as anti-Semitic. And kind of an apparatus was set up where you just heard the same talking points over and over again, the same slanders. And of course, in that kind of situation of protest, there are some dumb things that were done. I mean, if somebody looked into my record in the 60s, there are a couple of things I said, I hope they don't find out about. But, everybody, it always happens. There are dumb things. And there were probably a couple of anti-Semitic incidents. People got out of control and they attacked somebody for being Jewish, thinking they held this point of view or whatever. Most anti-Semitism in the United States is right-wing. It's young men who hear stuff on social media about Jewish conspiracies. Jews are bringing immigrants into the country so they change the vote. Jews run this, Jews run that, and so on. That's where most of it comes from. But, some people on the left say stupid things, and they don't know the history of Zionism that well. They say simple things that sound offensive. Maybe they act offensive and arrogant. That's certainly a problem on the left. It's always been there. So it's a complicated situation, but the small number of incidents got blown up into this idea that there was rampant anti-Semitism. That phrase, rampant, and you just heard that over and over again. And this led to these hearings under the Biden administration. Now, they may have been orchestrated by right-wing Republicans, but the hearings in which the presidents of Columbia and Harvard and so on were brought to Washington, you didn't hear Democrats protesting that much. You didn't hear Biden coming out against it that much, or Kamala Harris and so on. They went along with that. And that was the beginning of federal intervention into the universities. Those hearings before Trump, that set the tone, that opened the door so that Trump now had a cause here, rampant anti-Semitism. And where does it come from? Well, it must come from teaching critical race theory, and it must come from woke culture and so on. And that just opened the door to what happened afterwards. And there has been a complete transformation of the culture of the universities because of that charge about critical race theory and so on. And the diversity, equity, inclusion programs, DEI, have pretty much been wiped out. I mean, here at Michigan, even Michigan hasn't really been directly attacked by the government. But as soon as the climate changed, and I think some regions here were always against it anyway, we have some pretty reactionary, terrible people on the board of, and they're Democrats, they're not Republicans. And they were looking for this. And so they eliminated the terrific program we had here, led by a terrific African-American woman scholar who, as a result, just left the university, took another job. Just this kind of pre-capitulation set in all across the country. And now, because of the big pre-capitulation at the beginning with the major richest universities, such as Columbia, Harvard, and Brown, too, has made a deal, this thing has escalated to the point where they're attacking the whole California system. And states are going into action. In Indiana, they have all kinds of new rules and regulations that are coming from the state. And in Texas, as you noted at the beginning, they're firing these people just preemptively without any kind of due process because one actually believes that there might be more than two genders. My God, And another guy gave a socialist talk where, like any socialist, he talks about some future socialist transformation. He wasn't advocating any violent action in the present or whatever. And they're immediately just dismissed. No due process that I'm aware of. So yeah, from the beginning of October 2023, it's escalated steadily.
Now, clearly, when we look at the U.S. today and compare it to the way the country was in the McCarthy era in the 50s, there are enormous differences. For example, in the 50s, the ruling class, I think, was quite united. Capitalist democracy, such as it was stable, and there was mass support for the ruling class's anti-communism in a context where working class living standards were rising. In contrast, today, there are open rifts at the top in U.S. society, deep polarization through society, and the institutions of capitalist democracy are much weaker. We can talk about an asymmetrical radicalization where lots of people are radicalizing towards the far right, but also some people are radicalizing in a radical left direction, although unfortunately there's more people moving further to the right than moving left. And the quality of life for many people in U.S. society is declining. So with all these kinds of things in mind, what would you want to draw out and offer to younger leftists today in terms of the lessons that you think people should learn from the history that we've been discussing, things that will be helpful with resistance to repression in our time?
Yeah. Well, I have certainly thought about this a lot. And what you say, that there is a different situation in the 50s, and it's actually a better situation. Okay, so there is an international movement toward the right that's very dangerous. And I mean, you can't see what's happened with the Trump administration in and of itself. Our problem is not just one completely bonkers president. There's a worldwide right-wing development, and in many cases, it's got a religious aspect to it. And Christian nationalism in the United States is a serious problem. But on the other hand, there's a large opposition in the United States, and and a lot of it's liberal. There's also the question of the cause. So there's nobody's defending communism at this point. I mean, that's not the issue. The Palestine Israel issue, which is at the middle of it, it's complicated. It's not simple to explain. People have been indoctrinated for decades and seeing things from the pro-Israel point of view, and you have to break through that. But the cause is so just of the rights of Palestinians, and the behavior of Netanyahu and his government is so outrageous that it's being televised. I mean, it's hard for me to understand how any decent person can at least stop and think, there must be something wrong here. Although it is also true that most people in this country, are not that interested in international politics, just as most students are not even that interested in these political debates. I mean, here in Michigan, they're mostly interested in football games, and the parties and so on. So it's complicated, but it is different, and there is the possibility to fight back and win much more than in the 1950s. So the first lesson we have to learn is you can't rely on the universities. So we saw in the 50s pre-capitulation. As soon as they got wind that the government wanted to get rid of communists, they began turning over information, not just the university presidents, but deans, chairs of departments, and so on would turn over information on suspected communist students and faculty members. And the universities themselves, although they were not under economic threat, they immediately met with FBI agents and they agreed to target certain faculty. They made it clear that if the faculty didn't participate in these hearings, which were set up locally in the different states, if they didn't name names and completely break with communism, then they would lose their jobs. So there's hand in glove kind of thing. And of course, you had the business community ready to do the same thing, and you had a lot of the population and so on. So you can't depend on them. You can't look to them, and that's something that's maybe obvious to people like you and I who are trained in Marxist thinking. But a lot of people think, well, that maybe we can make compromise and make a deal. If we get rid of DEI, if we have new rules against the students, if we get rid of some of these, professors who are teaching controversial courses, like Cornell's just canceled the courses of Eric Heifetz, who was a world-class scholar on indigenous people and so on. If we can make these, maybe they'll go away. Well, we know that doesn't work. When you're dealing with a bully, the more you give in, the more aggressive they get. It's like blood in the water for a shark. So yeah, giving in just tells them they can come and beat you some more and get some more out of you. So we can't depend on them. We have to have our own methods of fighting back. So yes, we have to support any kind of faculty unions. Now, the AAUP has not been seen as a faculty union until now, but they seem to be stepping forward and acting like a union. And they're very effective in their lawsuits. I mean, the Harvard lawsuit against some of Trump's measures has been won, and the AAUP played a big role in that. So building groups like the AAUP and trying to unite the universities and colleges together, they're a force. What we have now is that the wealthiest ones, the ones that could fight back the most easily, who have billions of dollars in at their disposal, gave in right away. But if the universities would unite and collaborate and so on, they could put a halt to a lot of this. So we have to push to build these union-type groups and unity among the different universities. And also, there are faculty bodies that can play a good role. There's always been a faculty senate as long as I've been here, but it was useless up until recently. But then radicals went in and sort of took over the leadership and set in a good example. And now the faculty senate is a very important force here, putting pressure on the president as opposed to the pressure that the president is getting from the regions. And I think it's at the moment, even though there have been demands to fire several faculty, particularly for their Charlie Kirk remarks they made after Charlie Kirk's assassination, the university has taken a position, no, they're not firing these people because they said unpopular things about Kirk. So in any event, there are those things. But in general, for the left, I would say we're faced with three things that we have to do at the same time. And they're not identical, but they're all important. The top priority to me seems to be Gaza. And we can't let that be sacrificed, for other short-term gains. This Gaza horror, if they can get away with that, they can keep on going. We have to call a halt to that. There can't be U.S. support for this. There can't be complicity. People who are putting themselves on the line to speak out against what's happening in Gaza should be defended to the hilt and so on. Yes, there are people who do dumb things, provocative things. We shouldn't focus on attacking them. We should put forward the strategy and tactics that work. And that means building a mass movement around the demand for immediate ceasefire and for a program to rebuild Gaza and for eventually to develop a system, some kind of state form or forms that allow for safety and human rights and political freedom for every ethnicity in the region. That's the top priority, is building that movement. And in that case, you have to work with anybody who's willing to join you, anybody who's for immediate ceasefire, even if they don't think it's genocide. I mean, we know it's genocide, but if they don't want to use the term genocide, they want to say, well, it's war crimes. That's okay. Even if they're confused about what Zionism is, they don't think Zionism is what we think it is, and so on, that is a form of settler colonialism. That doesn't matter if they're willing to join us around these political demands. But the second thing is, we do have to get out the truth about the history of the Middle East. And we do have to have classes, and we do have to have alternative universities if they won't let us teach it in the right venue. We have to have ways of educating the American population to, the 100 years of oppression against Palestinians. And here we can't pull punches, and we have to give the facts, which are pretty upsetting and horrible, but they have to be known. That's the second thing. The third thing is, of course, defending the political rights of anybody whose free speech is violated, defending the right of DEI to return in some form, the rights of trans people, other things that are generally under attack. Women's rights in terms of controlling your own body. These are all things that we have to defend. And again, in this case, you have to unite with people with all different kinds of politics and different views. So you can't confuse all of these things. There's sort of three different projects, but we have to participate in all of them at once. And we have to figure out ways of negotiating these commitments. And this requires more discussion on the left. I don't know what your experience is in Canada, but I don't find a lot of open spaces to discuss different strategies and policies here. It seems like it's a little bit closed down, at least from my past experience.
I think that is a problem. And so wherever it is possible to create open coalitions and other spaces to have these discussions about strategy and tactics, I think it is very important to cultivate those. And I would just throw in, I'm sure you agree, I would just mention one other thing that I think needs to be woven into this, and that is the fighting back against all the various forms of attack by the federal government in the U.S. and by state governments on what's left of the welfare state, and attacks on federal government workers, public sector workers, and more broadly other kinds of labor struggles, connecting those with the democratic and international solidarity fights that you've mentioned. Just wanted to add that in as an additional dimension, I think. So that as the May Day Strong initiative trying to pull together the labor, more militant sections of labor in the context of Trump's assault. I think that's another important aspect of the fight back in the current moment in the U.S.
Yes.
Thanks very much for this very helpful historical discussion.
Okay, it's great.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcasts wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.